Okay, so we should be recording at this point, and the idea here was that there's been a lot of back and forth on what is a QI project, what is research with a capital R. This is a presentation, as I was saying, I usually give to medical residents and physicians who are in practice but would like to get a master's in public health so they kind of understand how to gather their own data. But I find that it's helpful to kind of go back to square one in terms of, where do these terms come from? What does it even mean? And so this presentation is on population health versus primary care quality improvement, from theory to praxis. So feel free to interrupt me or make comments as you'd like. I'm just going to kind of go through these slides. They usually give me an hour and a half to do this. And you'll note for the physicians, they need lots of breaks. So we won't be doing that, but let me know if it's going a little too quickly. So we're going to talk a little bit about population health versus primary care quality improvement, which essentially is theory to praxis. They usually get a break. And then I'm going to just reintroduce, because I'm sure you've seen these, 3 theories or conceptual models for substance use and abuse. That's kind of an easy space to jump off of, so that's why I usually pick that topic. And then we're going to talk about community-based approaches for data gathering. If we get to it and we have time, we'll talk about how do you actually use these theories and models to frame and contextualize the action that is generally your implementation project. And learning objectives, I think that's pretty obvious. But to just kind of get right into it, population health, is really with a capital P and a capital H. And this is defined as the health outcomes of a group of individuals, including the distribution of such outcomes within the group, right? So that's fairly general. But what it actually represents is these active partnerships across public health and industry and academia and healthcare and local governments and NGOs and lots of different groups to achieve positive health outcomes at the population level. So I have a girlfriend who studies this actually, and if you asked her what she does, she would say, I do population health. I study helminthic infections among rural people in sub-Saharan Africa, right? So what this really does is you're talking about informing policy. You're talking about really big, like, how worm infections are kind of impacting these sub-Saharan populations and kind of what we're supposed to do with it. And you really are talking about the larger theories of like understanding this experience. And so when we talk about population health, we really are looking at the more theoretical understanding of what's going on versus primary care quality improvement, which is really the monitoring and reacting to the day-to-day healthcare that's given by a provider, right, or a system. And so this involves all of these different players that you see there, right? The community and the system of care and the patient and their family and their team and their social determinants, and basically all of these experiences, and the providers have to have a holistic knowledge of this particular patient who's at the center and their barriers to health. So when you talk about quality improvement, it's not kind of the larger theory of helminthic infections in sub-Saharan Africa. It is, how do our patients in South LA navigate getting their anti-helminthic medications on a day-to-day, right? Because it's really focused on internal system improvements. And so these are kind of the procedures. So from the language that we're used to, which is kind of policy and procedures, this is the stuff that's much more kind of boots on the ground, getting some change, implementing and testing some interventions. So this is also what we call practice, right? So from policies and procedures, theory and practice, praxis is kind of a fancy word for practice, but that's basically what it is. So when we talk about this again, kind of from a historical lens, theory comes from Aristotle, right? This theodia, this idea that science and activities are concerned with knowing for its own sake, right? We're just adding to the general fund of human knowledge and what that might mean. Whereas praxis is kind of the action or doing, right? This is Greek again. So this idea that we're kind of in there creating interventions. These things can be regarded as opposites, and they're often seen as a hierarchical split in academia, which I'm sure you have seen. I've definitely seen it between like the PhDs and the DNPs, and kind of like what that means And within the traditional hierarchy, PhDs are generally more prized in these spaces, even though they're not necessarily doing things that are going to help out on a day-to-day basis in a health system. And the fact that there's this hierarchy and this traditional split is really the root of many failed interventions. I'm hearing some little things. I want to make sure that we don't have any chat messages that I'm missing. So I'm just going to check in real quick. It looks like we're okay. And so, so knowing that this is the root of many failed interventions, this is kind of the dichotomy that we're constantly encountering as nurses and scientists in healthcare that are kind of at the higher levels, right? We all have terminal degrees, and that means that we're kind of falling into one of these two buckets. We know that health research is judged by theory-driven population level change, right? But we also know that the theories driving the actual change have to be tested in the real world through interventions. So in an ideal world, these things, in a perfect world, these things would inform each other. We would develop the theoretical knowledge, use it to build interventions that we test in the real world. And when they work or don't work or kind of sort of work, we use that to then influence our overarching theory about how we're supposed to deal with this issue. This doesn't always happen. Very frequently, these two things live in their own separate spheres, but it's really not ideal in terms of moving on, rapidly accelerating issues like the pandemic, for example. So here's a game that we're going to play, and I can't see you, so you're going to have to speak up if you're interested. But I would like you to either hit the button up or no, or be willing to say yes or no if you'd like. These are instances where we did one without the other. So I'm going to show you some instances of when this kind of went horribly bad because we didn't do the full loop. We just did one or the other of these spheres. And let me know what you think. So the first one that I have is all theory, no practice, and this is called the play pump. Are you all familiar with the play pump? So this was kind of a big deal. I want to say now maybe like 8 to 10 years ago. But basically, this was a pump that was invented by a South African engineer, and it was really promoted by this agriculture executive. And the idea was that in certain parts of Africa where they had drought or they didn't have consistent access to clean water, they had a merry-go-round that was attached to a water pump. So kids that could just get on it and play would actually cause the water to be pumped into a storage tank, and then it would just be available on demand. So the women wouldn't have to go and manually pump it every time they needed water. The kids playing had already caused this, this water storage to happen. So you see in this little drawing, the kids are spinning around. It's pumping the water. So that's number one. It's pumping the water from the ground in 2 and 3. It's being funneled up into the tank 4. And then there's a woman at number 5 who's ready to kind of take that water off to wherever it is that it needs to go. Any thoughts on why this didn't work, given that it was all theory and no practice? So feel free to unmute yourself and guess if you'd like to. If you don't want to, that's no problem. But why might this not work?
Just a random guess. Perhaps the kids were scared of this. I don't know, maybe visually it wasn't inviting for kids to play with.
So I think that's actually a really good answer, right? When you invent this, which they did without actually talking to the kids or the women, yeah, there's any number of reasons why kids would not want to jump on this random play structure that didn't exist before, especially if it was built by an NGO that they may or may not trust. What actually happened for the project failure, which is actually a little bit about what you're talking about here. First off, there was no local survey of groundwater availability, so they built some of these without checking number 3, the actual groundwater level. So in some of these places, they had convinced people to try it, and the kids were trying, and there was no water. So trust is completely lost. So that seems pretty fundamental to me. The other thing was they had no discussion whatsoever with the local women about their role in it, basically. And collecting water is something that, like, generally the women would do, right? But the reality was another NGO had come in, and these women had been able to talk to them about their childcare needs, and they had started a whole school where the kids could go during the day. So the women would drop their kids off and then go get water. So there are no kids to do this like traditional merry-go-round pumping, because it's just the women by themselves. And these women were no way going to ride a merry-go-round to make this work. Right? Maybe they would pump the water because they were used to that, but they weren't going to go play on structures in order to make it happen. The last thing is that the actual math didn't work out based on how much energy it required to move this thing. And it turns out the kids would have to play for 27 hours every day to actually meet the water needs of the community. So this was a huge failure. But what you should know is that this caught the attention of Oprah and the Gates Foundation, and they put like $10 million into this project, and like, you know, built up all of these wonderful plans in their offices, wherever they were, Manhattan, and then went to Africa and tried to do this. And it was just like a colossal failure. So this is an example of like the theory makes sense, but in practice, they really fell short. Here's another one, practice without theory. So do you know about radium watch hands? Has anybody heard of this? So the idea, and I actually had a clock like this growing up. The idea was that radium is this glowing substance because it is radioactive. And if you paint it on watch hands, you can see them in the dark. It was originally used in military applications, but as it started kind of making its way into the industry and kind of like our capitalist society, different companies realized that they could sell these in just like for use in regular American homes. So they hired lots of women to do this. And any idea about the idea of doing this in practice, but without the theory behind it?
Well, it just killed them, that's all.
Yeah. And it was pretty bad. Not only did it kill them, but the women would often, in order to paint these very fine lines, would lick the brushes to make them a fine point. And so they would get like radium jaw that would basically like eat away the bones in the lower part of their face and their teeth. It was pretty horrific. But again, in practice, it makes sense. It seemed to work, and it seemed like, wow, this is a cool new advancement. But without the theory behind why is this even glowing and is this safe, you can end up in some hot water. And this is my last example. Does anybody know who that is? Because when I put this up last time, all these youngsters had no idea who that was. No, that's Eric Clapton. Okay.
Of course it is.
Maybe
but I'm old.
I need to find a more current thing, but I like Eric Clapton. Anyway, so this
do you know what he's up to lately?
No, I don't.
Oh my gosh, he will only perform if there are no vaccine mandates for the venues. He is funding a big anti-vaxxer thing. And also, you know, there was all that racist stuff from, you know, the 90s or 2000s. I love his music, but
that breaks my heart. The same thing happened with Morrissey with his nonsense, like anti-immigrant stuff. And honestly, the same thing happened with Bob Dylan for me. If you get awarded a Nobel Prize, you go. But hey.
Yeah, that was okay with me. I thought that was,
really?
You know, yeah,
I
it
was
was fine.
Dylan. So the thing is that if you asked him, or when they asked him, he would say that this, you know, 3-time Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee and world famous guitarist can't read music. So this would be practice without theory. And he's a musical genius. But like, is he? Any idea on how he does this? Like, is it real?
Are you going to like crush one of my?
No, I'm sorry. I am going to crush one of your. So in reality, a lot of musicians and actually their promoters will claim that people can't read music, but in fact, what they mean is they can't sight read it fluently, which means if you have an open, you know, you have the tablature or whatever right there, you can't read it and play it as you're reading it, which not a lot of people can do that. But if you were to just read it, you'd be able to go like, oh yeah, okay, I get it. I understand what that means. So part of it is that, you know, people sometimes downplay the background that they have or where they kind of came from in order to make it seem like what they're doing is a little bit more impressive, right? Oh, I have it right there, sight read, the ability to immediately play it as it's written. But maybe some people are geniuses. But how this works out in science is that I often talk to people who tell me that they don't have an underlying model or a conceptual theory, and they really shouldn't be doing anything if they don't. But they really do. They just don't know because they haven't reviewed the literature that what they're doing is actually the stages of change model, or like something really common and fairly well known that maybe they just aren't citing, but that's actually how they're doing it and why it's being effective. So sometimes, we can kind of luck into stuff, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're, a genius. So the idea here is that if we want to design implementations or interventions that we're able to implement in primary care settings that are going to be successful, we really want to take these population level theories and conceptual models that help us understand our world and understand that particular setting, and then use our knowledge of the space itself and the stakeholders and the culture and really include them. And that's kind of your quality improvement projects where you really have this substantive knowledge of the in situ reality. And we should be using both of those things to create logic models and design interventions, because that's where you don't kind of run into these weird spaces of like, how are the kids going to do that? They're all in daycare, right? Really logical, kind of obvious things that shouldn't be overlooked can sometimes be caught when you're doing this combination view. So this is my last one, and this is my favorite one because it's devastating, but it also really kind of opens up our eyes about understanding the in situ experience of what is it like for the people who are actually living it versus those of us who may come from these minority communities or historically underrepresented or under-resourced communities, but yet we're not of there anymore. We have gotten this education, have these terminal degrees, and that kind of removes us a bit, right? But we still need to remember to value that knowledge. So, the mystery of the shells. So the World Health Organization, this is like in the late 80s, early 90s, was very concerned with high neonatal and maternal mortality rates in Guatemala. It was really bad. It was in the 30%, and then it got into 50% at one point, and it was like an international global crisis, right, where everybody was responding. So who showed up? And they went to intervene, and they discovered that most of the childbirthing was done by these lay midwives, and they were using shells from local streams to cut babies' umbilical cords when they were, obviously when they're born. So they sent this team to provide training to these lay midwives, and they provided all of this modern surgical equipment and, really tried to improve the situation. And it actually caused a huge spike in the mortality rates beyond what was already happening, to the point where there was a huge question about whether the World Health Organization should even be allowed in Central America. Like, it was a huge deal. What happened? Any idea? Kind of a hard one, but I think
I would make a random guess that the shells sort of like antiseptic properties, and then they didn't know how to clean the tools, or I don't know, something along those lines. But maybe that's
the answer. They showed up with all this surgical equipment and no autoclaves and nothing disposable. So they were just reusing the things over and over again. And what they'd found out was the lay midwives would break the shells to get a sharp edge, which would actually create an almost sterile surface. And they would use them once and throw them away. So that actually wasn't the source of the maternal mortality. But, who provided all this training and equipment, but there was no way to clean it. And they were just spreading it. I mean, it was right back to the early days of like puerperal fever where the doctors weren't washing their hands, right? So do you think this is a theory or a practice failure? I'm actually going to answer.
Theory failure, because they were trying to put it into practice, but it didn't translate well into practice.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that it's interesting because what you actually said is that it's kind of both, because you did theory and practice. And I do think it's kind of both. It started with the theory, which was they forgot modern germ theory, basically. I don't know how they went in and just didn't think it through, but they did. And then in practice, they totally ignored the actual lay of the land, ignored that women had been delivering babies like this for thousands of years, right? And they should have been looking for what was different, not what had been done forever and was actually appropriate based on the, resource limitations they had. So it's kind of fascinating how you can get tripped up. And this is exactly why I think we need to get off our high horse about theory is up here, PhDs, blah, 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 and the actual individuals who are doing the work in the trenches with these quality improvement, performance improvement projects. We really need to recognize that both of these contributions are huge contributions, and really listen to each other a little better, I think, than we have been. It's not really encouraged in the field, which I think is unfortunate. This is a thing that I like to throw in sometimes about situational analysis, which I'm not going to talk about right now, other than to say, I've mentioned this before in talks, and if you're ever feeling a little bit stuck about where to go with your research, you may want to check this out, Situational Analysis. This is by Adele Clark, and it really helps you kind of situate your particular research issue within things. So sorry, I don't know why that slide is in there, but it is a good thing. So given that the immediate conditions of the science you're trying to do, the intervention that you're trying to do is so critical, why do we even care about theory, right? Because it's super abstract. And if it has to be flexible and adapt in the moment, like theory schmeary, right? Except that, and this is best illustrated off of Google Scholar, I think, because if you open the homepage of Google Scholar, it says right at the bottom, this is actually making me emotional. Isn't that crazy? That's how much I love science. Stand on the shoulders of giants. And that's the idea here, is that we are all, as researchers, in whatever way that we are, right? Whether it's a very small qualitative study of 4 people about their experience on a particular unit, or we're doing really huge, meta-analyses of like national data, we are all doing it for the species. We're doing it for the legacy of humankind. And we are contributing to this international conversation that's being had all the time with each other about how we can make things better for humans. And so,
I'm going to interrupt you for a minute.
Yes.
I just got a notation that people are waiting in the lobby.
Oh, well, thank you for interrupting. I don't know how to let them in. Did anybody else see the pop-up?
I let them in.
Yay, thank you. All right, can you see the Google Scholar again?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, good. And you let me get a hold of myself a little bit. I believe strongly in doing this. And I think that when we forget to close the loop on the scientific process by publishing, we deprive all of the scientists that are in this connected web of experience with us right now internationally, whether we feel them or not. And that's why we got to get you all to conferences, so you remember that those people are out there all the time waiting for your contribution and adding their own contribution. But we also seriously hamper what we can do in the future, because all of the lessons aren't lessons learned. They're just lessons that that one was a dud, right? And I know, for example, there's a person right now on this call who did a study that did not turn out the way they thought it was going to be, and they haven't published it yet. You know who I am talking about, because I know that you're on there. That sort of stuff informs other people's time, and they don't waste their time in the future on things that are ineffective. But in a larger sense, they contribute to our not only knowledge, but our epistemologies, or our ways of knowing the stuff that we know. So this is all really important. And that's why I encourage people to consider theory. Even if you're doing a project, boots on the ground, make sure that the theory is there, and tell people about how you applied the theory and whether it worked for you, right? Stand on the shoulders of giants. That's what we're here to do. This right now, God, what is up with me? But this right now, right here, this is our immortality, you guys. This. we help the people that we help on the floor, and a lot of that energy goes off into the ether. Yes, it sometimes changes people's life, but the science that we develop is forever. So, given that, I'm about to go into 3 very common theories and conceptual models that you may or may not have heard of. But if you've done any sort of public health education or kind of advanced nursing education, you probably have run into these before. I will say that these are the 3 most cited conceptual models that I ever see. And I work primarily in a chronic illness space for diabetes and hypertension. And of course, I do my burnout studies for providers. These I know are also really heavily used in substance use research, but you probably recognize them even if you don't know their names. So before I go on to anything else, I'm going to just stop for a couple minutes and stop presenting and see if there's any questions or any thoughts that people want to share right now. And don't forget that we are recording. Okay, no problem. I am going to go back to my soliloquy. All right, here we go. So the socio-ecological model, also called Bronfenbrenner, and trans-theoretical model by Prochaska, also known as the stages of change, and the health belief model, which has been largely discredited, and I apologize if you still use it. It's about to get a rough go of it right now. So the socio-ecological model really posits that everything is connected. Everything can affect everything else. And as the parts interact, these different levels interact, they create the character and function of the whole. So this is used a lot in public health literature, and it really is taking a holistic view of, for example, an individual's ability to go along with a treatment regimen that's been assigned to them. For example, let's say that I have one of my patients with diabetes and I tell them I need you to exercise because that's going to help bring down your blood sugar. Well, the individual may have certain knowledge or attitudes or skills associated with being able to exercise, right? They may, in my world, I work with older Latina women. They may think that it's unladylike or that it's taking critical time away from their family. I'm not just saying these things are in the literature, right? And so I always kind of situate them within this model and think about that. But when I think about the criticism that it's not ladylike or that it's going to impact their other duties to the family, including childcare and cooking and shopping and that sort of thing, that then becomes an interpersonal realm issue. It goes beyond the individual because it's affecting their families and their friends and their social networks. And in some ways, when I look at the situation maybe with like their work, and I think about the fact that, you know, their daughter has to work a full-time job because she's a single mom and it doesn't provide for childcare, right? That is how the organizational structures start to influence this woman's ability to not really comply, but adhere to what we've recommended her to do. In a larger sense, within her community, there may or may not be green spaces that allow for exercise and would require maybe a membership at a gym, which is something that, you know, precludes the exercise I'd like her to do as a patient. And then in a larger sense, why aren't there green spaces for her to exercise, right? That reflects public policy that historically divests certain communities or divests in certain communities and disenfranchises different groups in terms of access to spaces that are safe and you know, supportive of recreation, right? So when I talk to a patient about them beginning an exercise regimen, in my mind, I'm framing it within the socio-ecological model. But as a researcher, if I'm going to do an intervention about exercise, I have to kind of think about it in this larger sense, right? Because again, if I just say, I'm going to pay for a gym membership for everybody who participates in my study for a year, it may fall flat. And without really understanding the theory behind what barriers might exist, I might not understand why it fell flat, or worse, I may assign a false reason for it falling flat to the actual data, and that's not good. But there are some critiques about this model. As you can tell, I really like this model. I use it a lot. It's really challenging to evaluate all of these different components empirically, right? Because I am a constructivist, which means I believe that we create our environment around us as an active process by interacting with each other and with objects, right? That's a lot to hold in your mind at one time when you're doing these interventions or designing a study. So it's a little bit too much for people who aren't, super like woo woo in the whole headspace thing. I think I've already explained the woo-woo alarm in another video, but when I start getting a little too theoretical and kind of conceptual, I like to hit the woo-woo buttons to just warn you that that's where it's going. So anyway, but people also say this is difficult to apply because everything in somebody's environment needs to be taken into account. And how are you going to do that when you see 20 patients a day? You really going to take the time to ask them about all of this stuff? And when it's not just directly related to practice, but you're designing a study, how many levels of this do you need to account for when you're just trying to do a simple exercise intervention? How are you going to explain it to IRB, right? How are you going to explain it to your funders? So it is a little complicated, but I think that sometimes there's a lot of beauty in complexity. So it's a model that I do recommend. This is the stages of change model. And I bet you have seen this model because this was actually a really big deal. I want to say like in the 90s. And like maybe early 2000s. And this is the dominant model of health behavior change for substance use because Prochaska himself, the author, invented it to really, on a personal note, he had a lot of alcoholism in his family, and this was something that he was interested in because of that. So it's always been kind of used in that substance use space. But is this the idea that change is a process involving progress through a series of stages? And it implies that the individual is the locus of control, right? So I myself kind of decide consciously or subconsciously where I am in this. So like, am I ready to start that exercise program? If I'm just kind of thinking about it, or not even thinking about it, but I know that it exists, but I'm not really thinking about it, which is exactly where I am, frankly, with an exercise program, then I'm in the pre-contemplation stage. So if you try to get me to do it, my answer is no. Right? I'm not even thinking about that. But when I start kind of thinking about it and considering it, now I've shifted to a maybe. I got to think about this more. And then I get to a place where I decide, you know what, I need to do something about this because I'm just sitting down for 12 hours a day and it's not good for me. So I'm in the preparation stage where I start kind of preparing, what could I do? Should I buy some tennis shoes? Like, should I like join a gym? Should I just like start walking? Now I'm starting to prepare and plan. And then my next stage is I'm just going to go do it. I'm going to buy my tennis shoes. I'm going to go start walking, and I'm in the action phase. And then if I do it for a couple of weeks, I'm in the maintenance phase. I need to just kind of keep going. But at any point, something can kind of knock me off this trajectory and I can relapse right back to like, nah, I don't even want to think about that right now. I'm right back to pre-contemplation. So this stages of change model is important in terms of designing a study because you want to make sure that your intervention touches on where your participants are going to be. So let's say that I have created this intervention for my older Latina women living with diabetes who are thinking about this exercise regimen. And I really want to talk about long-term adherence because as it turns out, engaging in regular exercise is fantastic for building muscle, which really prevents serious fractures and things during a fall, right? So I want to get Latina women in their 40s, make sure that they keep exercising up into their 60s. So I'm doing like a long-term thing. I want to look for people who are in the maintenance phase or the action phase, like they're already doing it. If I recruit people that are in the pre-contemplation phase or even in the contemplation or preparation phase, I'm going to spend a ton of my energy during the study just trying to convince them that this is the right thing to do. Whereas if I get women who are already there, they've already got a plan, I can figure out how to tailor my intervention to support their plan and give it some longevity, right? So you could see how this might be helpful. There are some critiques, the biggest one being, what about communal cultures? So I don't think I've ever said this before to any of you all at SMU, but when I got into UCLA, I got the Dean's Fellowship, which is like pretty substantial funding, because I pitched, I am going to do a cultural adaptation of the stages of change model. I think that it's inappropriate to assume that anybody's ability to comply with some sort of positive behavioral lifestyle intervention is based on individual decision really excludes multi-generational households and communal cultures. And they loved it because it is a valuable critique. I didn't end up doing that. So if anybody wants to do that, there's definitely a place for it. But, you know, it's kind of a big deal. And it's why I generally think about this a little bit, but I don't always use it in my research. The other thought here is that it implies that people never truly recover. You're never actually better. You're never actually, you know, in a place where you're in a stable weight that's good for your blood sugar. You're never actually an X substance user. You are somebody who forever, once you're deemed somebody who needs to change their life for the better somehow, you never get to actually claim that success, which I think is a little bit of a problem, but again, it's still useful in some ways. And now this is the health belief model. Can I get a hey there, or hey if you've heard of this model? Okay, because maybe people haven't heard of this model, but I think that this model has done a tremendous amount.
Yes, I've heard of it.
Have you heard of it? I think this model has done a tremendous amount of damage, but absent other modern models, it's what we had. And I myself, I'm ashamed to say, was asked at the time. I was the director of utilization, capitation, and case management for the children's hospitals in Orange County and in San Diego. But Cal Optima, which was this huge system that encompassed many insurance companies that mostly focused on Medi-Cal providers, they had me speak in front of like hundreds of people. And they said, we need you to pick a model for our care delivery for Orange County. And this is what I presented, not knowing any better. And what I basically said was people's beliefs and their perceptions of the benefits versus the barriers explains whether or not they're engaging in these health promoting behaviors, right? So it basically is like your beliefs and knowledge, which is something we can change, is the main thing that's stopping you, which I realize now really did not account for the many, many barriers that my population in Orange County, especially like living in Santa Ana, that had so many other challenges to them uptaking these positive behaviors. It was just a very immature response on my part, and I always regret it. But in any case, this was developed like in the 40s to explain and predict people uptaking health beliefs. I think it was in the 40s, maybe 50s. The idea is that you have demographic variables and psychological characteristics, but basically, despite your unique scenario and situation and historical legacy of trauma or anything, basically, how much at risk you think you are, your perceived susceptibility and how bad it might happen if it happens to you, how much you perceive the benefits of you actually doing this and what you think the barriers are to you engaging, plus the motivation leads to and determines the action, right? And so again, I think that there are beneficial uses of this model. I myself have used it poorly in the past and have recommended others use it poorly in the past, for which I carry that for sure. But I don't think that it's like all bad, but the critiques are that it doesn't account for like addiction, right? Things you can't control necessarily, the safety of your environment, right? Or your access to things, right? When I was in Orange County, the access disparities were crazy. There were like the people who lived in like enormous mansions by the beach. There were also the people that were living like 8 people in a 2-bedroom apartment. It was rough. It also doesn't explain for certain counterintuitive findings that we have in the research. Like, are you familiar with the sweet spot for diabetes education? This is a really fascinating counterintuitive thing, which is the number of people who are given diabetes education in a household has a sweet spot. If you educate a certain amount, it actually improves diabetes preventing behaviors in the house. But if you educate too many, it actually reduces adherence to these behaviors. We don't know why that is. We don't know if it's that if you overeducate the family on diabetes, they all watch each other and criticize each other about whether or not they're doing it, and therefore that leads to binging. We don't understand why it is, but there is, you know, counterintuitive findings, not just in that study, but in others, where it's not just about your beliefs. There is something else that causes people sometimes to make the choices that are bad for them, but they still do it. And we need to figure out how to loop in people who know better, but just don't do better. So anyway, I'm open to hear people defend the health belief model if you're interested. I am often wrong, and I'm always happy to learn things. But when we go into the Q&A, feel free to let me know if I got it all wrong. It won't be the first time. And then here is kind of a modern take, and I say modern because it's 2008, but there's a lot of efforts to use community-based participatory research, which is really more a method than it is a theory, except it does involve a lot of theoretical foundations. The idea here is that it's a partnered approach that involves community members and organizational representatives and researchers, but you involve people in all aspects of the research process so that you don't accidentally make one of these mistakes in terms of either theory or praxis, actually, because everybody's contributing expertise and they're sharing in the decision-making and ownership. So you're not kind of just going and imposing your thoughts. You're really getting active feedback from the people who are living the phenomenon. It doesn't always result in an intervention. Sometimes it's just discussion, but it always involves giving the information back to the community that helped you understand it. And so instead of steps or a framework, it has principles, and they're all here. I'm not going to read them, but essentially it promotes co-learning, and it's an empowering process that attends to social inequities. That's just kind of a foundational principle that those things exist and have to be addressed. Yeah, and then I have here positive and ecological perspectives. That's really important because when you do any sort of health disparities work, which is kind of the world I swim through, especially with my research, it's very tempting to do a deficits perspective, right? Which is this idea of what's wrong with this group, how they need our help, what traditionally has happened to them, which, none of that's not true. It's just that it under recognizes and doesn't give enough credit to the fact that there's resilience and beauty in a lot of these communities. And it's not all just kind of a deficit of good things. So here's where I would normally do a break. And I think I will take a second, but I am going to talk about how do we use these theories and models to frame or contextualize or like take our next action step. So I am going to stop. And
I have to jump off now. Thank you.
No problem. I will have the recording. Thank you for staying with us so much. All right. So any thoughts or ideas or questions? Everybody okay? Okay. So I'm going to finish up. And generally, I ask people to do these activities to help them kind of practice figuring out if you're using, the theory and the praxis in terms of whatever intervention you're doing. So for the first activity, we try to get people to, basically create a standardized patient and say, what person are you designing this study for? And you can write in whatever you want. So when we did this live last time, people said women, they said white male, somebody with an opiate addiction, somebody who's living with pain, right? But when you do this sort of thing, you can actually copy paste that. That is your inclusion criteria. Whatever it is that's important to you, this forces you to just get it on paper so that you kind of start to see, what do I need to look for in terms of a framework that has traditionally been used with this population? And then our second activity was, do you already know what's wrong, right? Don't be cagey. If you have a sense of what you think you're going to find in your research or what you think you're angling your questions to, towards exploring, get it out there. Write it down, right? Make sure that if you have pre-existing biases or even just conceptions of what's going on, that you document it and then you make sure you either bracket it and put it to the side or really dig in and find out what existing studies have been done with the expectation that the concept here is resilience, right? So if I believe this group is resilient, then I need to use that in my search terms at least once when I'm looking at the literature review, right? And then we have inductive and deductive reasoning. The idea here is, are you putting together lots of clues to come up with a larger theory, which is inductive, or are you having this kind of overarching theory and then trying to understand and figure out how you got there, which is deductive? It's okay to do either one, but you got to pick. You can't say, I want to explore, antecedents to exercise among Latina women, but you know what? I think that the whole problem is they don't have childcare, right? Like, I can't do it from both ends. I need to say, I want to explore childcare as a barrier to exercise and really understand it. Or I want to understand barriers to exercise, but I have nothing that I'm going to put higher than anything else. I'm just going to leave it open. So if the main thing is transportation, I'm not going to ignore it because in my mind, I'm holding a place for childcare, right? And then, oh, there we go, deductive versus inductive. So I think we talked about that. And it looks like I actually did it backwards. And then, of course, who cares? I like people to answer this internally because, again, all of these things translate to money. And when we're talking about studies, we're also talking about funding. And it's important to think about, as I design this study, is it scalable? Am I doing a pilot or a feasibility study and then thinking about, I'm going to take it to the state or I'm going to take it nationally? Get that stuff down now so that we know what right questions you need to be asking when you're doing the smaller studies. Is it sustainable? If I change my mind and I decide to do something else, is anybody else going to pick up this torch? Once I publish it, is it going to be usable by somebody else? Are they going to take it somewhere? And then in terms of social capital, am I able to do this? Do I have entry into one of these communities that is going to really let me make this a reality? Or am I just saying, I think I want to study truck drivers on the Kinshasa highway? I had a friend who decided that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to do HIV testing among truck drivers, like on the Kinshasa highway. And I was like, do you know anybody there? Do you know any truck drivers? Right? Like, this has to be something that you recognize is a limitation. So ask yourself, do I have the social capital and connections to do this? So that's the idea. This is kind of a big complex thing in terms of theory and practice or praxis. But unless we actually ask ourselves these questions, make it really explicit to ourselves and our readers, this was the theory I started with. I wanted to set out to prove something, or I wanted to set out to explore something. And this is why I chose my population. This is why I chose the intervention. We can really run into a place where we invest a tremendous amount of time and energy and have nothing to show for. Because generally, negative results are not publishable. And if you can't publish, you have no real evidence that you actually invested all this time. So that's it. I know that was a little bit heavier than we usually go. But I do think it's important to know that if you're running into this wall, you're not the only one. This is kind of historically an issue in this space, but it is, surmountable. We just have to make sure that we're really clear about what we're doing. So I am going to stop. I did stop sharing. I'm going to stop recording and we'll be here for some questions. But thank you very much for tuning in.